For this third episode of Spin Journalism, I thought I'd do two articles at the same time. One from the right and one from the left. I think it will be constructive to point out the ways in which both appear to be more subjective than objective, and the apparent differences between bias on the right and bias on the left. But first, a word about bias. Bias, in my estimation, is not something you can ever truly overcome, and I never expect a total lack of bias from these news sources. All people, and by extension news agencies, are going to be inherently biased on some level, but it's important to understand that doesn't give you a free pass to abandon objectivity. While no media will ever be truly objective, objectivity should still be an ideal to strive for, to get as close as possible to. From my perspective, news sources are not biased and unbiased, but rather good biased and bad biased. I'll explain the distinction as I see it here. Good biased is a label I would use for news organizations that are not very subjective in their active reporting on issues, but that instead simply choose to report only issues that happen to fit their ideological narrative. When tackling an issue, these news outlets typically report in a very objective, factual manner, and very rarely, or do not at all, inject their personal opinions into the topic being discussed. Their bias comes from the stories that they choose to cover. The excuse typically given for this type of biased behavior is that there are only so many hours in the day and we can only cover so many stories. These happen to be the stories we considered to be the most important. Plus, with all the other news agencies out there, especially insert ideologically opposed news organization here, we're sure they'll cover the things we didn't have time to. Honestly, this is actually a good defense, and I think a fair point. There is only so much time in the day, and as long as you're reporting objectively on the events you actually end up covering, and you don't skip any seriously important issues, I don't mind a little biased curation. You're obviously not going to have time to cover everything. Might as well cover the things you're interested in or are an expert in. This style of reporting is also what motivates me to try to listen to ideologically opposed pundits daily, as it's likely they will both cover things the other tried not to because it wasn't politically convenient for them. And in this way, I'm getting the full story and both sides of the issue. So with that being the case, what would constitute bad bias? Bad biased is a label I would use for news organizations that actively inject their subjective opinion into their reporting, in addition to curating the issues they cover to fit their narrative. If we were to picture media consumption as food consumption, bad biased news sources would be analogous to a pufferfish. You have to be careful and informed enough to pick out the bad, unusable, and downright poisonous parts of your meal out, so that you can actually get to the useful and nutritious parts. After all, that is why you are consuming the meal. I find that if I am going to consume media that I would term as bad biased, the objective information morsels that I get out of the piece need to be worth the amount of spines and poison I'm going to have to pick out of my meal. If the ratio of poison to food is not good enough, it would be a waste of my time to eat that meal, if I'm making sense. Examples of sites I would consider to be bad biased would be the Huffington Post and Breitbart. Consequently, these two sites will be where we are getting our articles today, and without further ado, let's jump into them. The two articles we're going to be looking at are Seth Meyers roasts Stephen Miller for being really creepy, courtesy of the Huffington Post, and John Bolton, trying to get China to help with North Korea has failed for 25 years, courtesy of Breitbart. Now, both of these articles are clearly biased, and it only took us a glance at their titles to see this. However, they seem to be biased in different ways. We'll take a look at the Huffington Post's piece first. The first thing the title does is imply two statements that we are to take as fact as we read this article. One, that Seth Meyers is both correct and scathing in his breakdown of Stephen Miller, and two, that Stephen Miller is inherently and objectively creepy. The bias of this title, and from many titles like it on the left-wing bias sphere, comes from a bunch of presuppositions that are made under the table, and that the reader is hoodwinked into accepting by reading the article. But of course, this is just the title. If we look further into the article itself, we can see more evidence of bias. In the article, we are shown a couple of choice lines that Mr. Meyers had for Mr. Miller, mostly about how creepy he is, or how much he apparently looks like a horror movie villain. These statements are juxtaposed with a a small clip of Myers looking terrified at a picture of Miller. These statements and this clip are both here to reinforce the presupposition from the title that Stephen Miller is creepy. And in the final paragraph, we find yet more examples of Huffington Post's left-wing bent. First, their use of a group N-word, in this case problematic, shows other cult members reading that the author of this piece is also a member of their cult. This goes to build loyalty with the in-group. And finally, at the end here, the article names Sean Hannity from Fox News and Sarah Huckabee Sanders as both being pleased with Miller's behavior. By naming two people that the left tends to hate, especially considering one of them is from Fox News, the article attempts to reinforce that this creepy person is also loved by members of the outgroup, making you feel even better about finding him creepy. And now for a little subjectivity myself before I move into the Breitbart article. I'm sorry, but I just don't see it. I don't think he looks creepy. And honestly, even if I thought he was, saying that he's creepy is not a refutation of any of his positions. It just sounds like something a child would say after they lost an argument. This article is basically just an enormous ad hominem attack and does nothing to address the substance of the case he was making. But if they can get you to associate this guy with being creepy, they've already poisoned the well for when he starts presenting his case. If you think he's creepy, you're less likely to listen, even if what he's saying makes sense. But let's move on to the Breitbart piece for an example in a different kind of bias. The Breitbart article is entitled, John Bolton, trying to get China to help with North Korea, has failed for 25 years. So they seem to be attempting to impress the opinion into their readers that trying to get China to help with North Korea will not be fruitful. But there's actually a clever layer to this title that gives them plausible deniability against bias. The title of this article isn't a statement by Breitbart. It's a quote. Should anyone challenge the author of this article on their apparent intent to impart their opinion on foreign affairs into the reader, the author could theoretically just say, "Hey, I was just quoting John Bolton for the title. It's not my fault he said something I thought was title-worthy." Using this trick, Breitbart can get away with equally as biased titles as the Huffington Post, but where the Huffington Post wears its bias on its sleeve and unabashedly flaunts its lack of objectivity, Breitbart seems to at least attempt to conceal their bias under this quote title smokescreen trick. The article is still going to lean heavily in the exact direction the quote for the title implies, but the author can correctly state that those aren't his words, and that he's simply quoting someone relevant to the issue that backs up his position. This phenomenon appears to be common across left-wing and right-wing news sites, with the left brazenly flaunting their naked bias and the right attempting to cover theirs up. While I would still consider all these sites to be biased in their own ways, it appears as if years of harassment and accusations of bias from the left have caused the right to be incredibly careful when presenting their case. Although the bias is still there, they do their utmost to hide it. Now, typically when I see biased pieces on Breitbart, this is the style in which that bias presents itself. A quote meant to lay the groundwork for a position to be advocated for in the article, or a quote from the member of the outgroup, immediately poisoning the well for their future statements in the article. But this is not to say that Breitbart does not engage in the sort of clever synonym manipulation that left-wing journalists seem to be so fond of nowadays. I'll give a couple examples. In my first episode of Spin Journalism, I covered a pretty clear-cut case of this phenomenon in the Huffington Post article, Jake Tapper Nails the Hypocrisy in Trump's Buy American Executive Order. And to heavily summarize, the operative words in this title are nails and hypocrisy. For a more in-depth look at that one in particular, I would advise watching the video. Another more recent example would be this Huffington Post piece entitled Scathing Washington Post Editorial Trashes Donald Trump for Defending Bigots. Note the use of visceral descriptor words such as scathing, trashes, and bigots. A fairer title might have been Washington Post Criticizes Trump for His Charlottesville Comments. Their title, however, simultaneously accomplishes a few things. First, it implies that this scathing editorial trashed Trump, as if utterly devastating him with its expert and brilliant takedown of his evil, bigot-defending actions. We are set up from the title alone to believe not only that the Washington Post expertly defeated his statements, but that they are also his moral superiors. The definitive language used at the end of the title, explaining that the takedown was for defending bigots, implies it is not only well known, but factual that the defense of bigotry was Trump's intention. This is despite the fact that Trump specifically denounced bigotry by name in his comments on Charlottesville. Trump's statements were only attacking. He never defended anything. The problem Huffington Post had with his statements, presumably, is that he attacked both sides instead of just the white supremacists. Now, you could argue that not specifically calling them out is less effective an attack than if he had named them, and I'd be inclined to agree. But I think it's a far cry from the truth to claim that he was defending them. However, like I said, there are examples of this type of tactic being employed by the right as well. In articles such as Monoculture, Left Smacks Facebook for Lack of Staff Diversity, as well as Leftists Launch Attack on Maryland State Flag, calling it Confederate Symbol. For the first article, the operative word is smacks. A fairer title, objectively describing the situation at hand, might have been Left Questions Facebook Staff Diversity. Question is a neutral word that brings with it very few positive or negative connotations, especially in this context. By contrast, the word smack carries with it decisively negative connotations associated with violence. The word smack was, seemingly, intentionally chosen for this reason. By using the word smack, the title presents an image of a radical left-winger physically striking Facebook over a matter many of Breitbart's news readers would be inclined to consider trivial. This juxtaposition of what is believed to be a small issue with a mind's-eye image of a frothing left-winger assaulting innocent businessmen already paints us a pretty clear picture of which direction this article is going to lean. The same basic principle holds true in the other article mentioned. Leftists launch attack on Maryland State Flag, calling it Confederate Symbol. This time conjuring up an image of violent radical protesters launching a military campaign against, in this case, the state of Maryland. Dropping the violent and negative connotations of the phrase launch attack, a more neutral title would have likely been something along the lines of Leftists assert Maryland State Flag as Confederate Symbol. But I've been naming all these examples of this specific phenomenon for a reason. In the comment section of my first spin journalism video, a fellow by the username of David Birchler related to me some very pertinent information, namely that the phenomenon I've been demonstrating here has a name. Russell Conjugation, named after Bertrand Russell. I'll link the page to a larger description of this phenomenon in the description to this video down below, but I'll read some of the more pertinent parts here so that we can really get a handle on what exactly is going on with these articles. By holding focus groups with new real-time technology that let participants share emotional responses to changes in authoritative language, Luntz was led to make a stunning discovery that pushed Russell's construction out of the realm of linguistics and into the realm of applied psychology. What he found was extraordinary. Many, if not most people, form their opinions based solely on whatever Russell conjugation is presented to them, and not on the underlying facts. That is, the very same person will oppose a death tax while having supported an estate tax seconds earlier, even though these taxes are two descriptions of the exact same underlying object. Further, such is the power of emotive conjugation that we are generally not even aware that we hold such contradictory opinions. Thus, illegal aliens and undocumented immigrants may be the same people, but the former label leads to calls for deportation, while the latter one instantly causes many of us to consider amnesty programs and paths to citizenship. As a little aside here before I continue with the reading, that paragraph in particular is interesting to me. I frequently hear moral outrage coming from the left whenever what they term as undocumented immigrants are instead referred to as illegal immigrants. They claim the reason they don't like this term is that no person is illegal. But from the get-go, I was always confused with this argument. No one is making the claim that the person is illegal, but that their actions were illegal in crossing the border against the law or overstaying on their visas. Now it seems we know the true reason the left is so adamant to change the language around this debate. If they can ensure everyone refers to them as undocumented immigrants, this gives them a vastly superior starting position for their argument, simply because of the Russell conjugation advantage. But, continuing. The basic principle of Russell Conjugation is that the human mind is constantly looking ahead, well beyond what is true or false, to ask, what is the social consequence of accepting the facts as they are? While this line of thinking is obviously self-serving, we are descended from social creatures who could not safely form opinions around pure facts, so much as around how those facts are presented to us by those we ape, trust, or fear. Thus, as listeners and readers, our minds generally mirror the emotional state of the source, while in our roles as authoritative narrators presenting the facts, we maintain an arsenal of language to subliminally instruct our listeners and readers on how we expect them to color their perceptions. Russell discussed this by putting 3 such presentations of a common underlying fact in the form in which a verb is typically conjugated. I am firm. Positive empathy. You are obstinate. Neutral to mildly negative empathy. He, she, it is pig-headed. Very negative empathy. In all 3 cases, Russell was describing people who did not readily change their minds. Yet, by putting these descriptions so close together and without further factual information to separate the individual cases, we were forced to confront the fact that most of us feel positively toward the steadfast narrator and negatively toward the pig-headed fool, without any basis in fact. So now, let's take a look at one of our examples from earlier. Left smacks Facebook for lack of staff diversity. Negative empathy. Left questions Facebook staff diversity. Neutral empathy. Facebook taken to task by left for lack of diversity. Positive empathy. As you can see, simply by switching some of the words around and plugging in a couple synonyms, we can completely change the tone of the title while still describing exactly the same situation. Next time you find yourself reading through the articles from some of these news sites, see if you yourself can find a title that seems to preemptively cast the rest of the article in a positive or negative light. Russell Conjugation is a shell game so-called journalists like to play with their readership, because they assume you will be too stupid or ignorant to figure out their little trick. Until next time, keep your eye on the pearl. All it takes for us to see through their tricks is knowing where to look.